Thank you for that introduction and good morning, everyone. So I'm Jamie Brunette, and my PIRE project is comparing performance on sign language tests in deaf preschool age children with a delay. My Penn State PIRE advisor is Dr. Carol Miller, and I was partnered with Dr. Thomas Allen of Gallaudet University. So just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to start with my project and move into the product of our work, and finally talk about my overall PIRE experience. So our objective was to compare performance of participants based on tasks from the visual communication and sign language checklist deemed difficult for deaf children of deaf adults and or of hearing adults. We chose to conduct this study because deaf children have variable language outcomes, making it difficult to determine who has a language delay or disorder. In addition to this, our work is a continuation of previous PIRE fellows, Dana Winthrop and Maura Yeager, and it complements their findings. Dana and Maura began studying deaf children of deaf adults with a delay, and we widened our investigation to those of deaf or hearing parents so we could compare their performances. So the Visual Communication and Sign Language Checklist, the VCSL, was developed by Sims, Baker, and Clark. They wanted to create this comprehensive visual language assessment for children learning a sign language. This is the first test of its kind to be standardized as well. So the test allows assessors to identify both feeling and basal levels for the children, and therefore we can compare them to the norming sample. The VCSL contains 114 items that are sequenced developmentally from ages 0 to 5 as well. So participants were scored on the VCSL using a 4-point scale, where 1 is not yet emerging, 2 is emerging, 3 is inconsistent use, and 4 is mastery for each item. This is a small part of the VCSL test for reference. So an assessor, such as a parent, teacher, or physician, would take an item such as possessive pronouns, like his or hers, which would look like this, and score the child's language use of this item from not yet emerging, ranging up to that mastery. So our participants came from an existing national database, and we narrowed our targets down to children who were ages 3, 4, or 5, who had at least a 24-month basal age delay, and their parents were using all or most ASL with them. We then split this group into 2 cohorts by their parents' hearing status, and we ended up with 22 deaf children of hearing parents and 32 deaf children with at least 1 deaf parent. So in thinking ahead, I had hypothesized that between our 2 cohorts, we would flag more items of difficulty for the children of hearing parents compared to those of deaf parents. So in order to determine if our 2 cohorts actually perform differently, we wanted to identify items of difficulty for the deaf of hearing and deaf of deaf group, as well as items that were particularly difficult for both groups. So an item was deemed difficult for a cohort if no participants had scored in this mastered category and more than 50% scored in the not yet emerging category. An item was not flagged as difficult if 50% or more participants within a group scored better than not yet emerging. So a statistical analysis of our participants' performance on the VCSL resulted in 8 items deemed difficult across the 3 age groups. We're first going to dive deeper into these items, and then I'll return to this visual. So this graph shows all 3-year-olds with at least a 24-month basal age delay. The whole of this graph has really rich data that is undergoing further analysis, but for our specific project, we'll be focusing within this orange box under the home language where parents are using all or most ASL with their children. So these top bars are the deaf children of hearing parents, and the bottom bars are deaf children of at least 1 deaf parent and their performance on items 48, 57, and 63. So item 48 is producing a 3 or 4 sign sentence, and this could be something like, my name is Jamie, and item 48 was deemed specifically difficult for the deaf of deaf group. Item 57 is preliminary or some understanding of a timeline, such as today or yesterday, and this was deemed difficult for both the deaf of hearing and deaf of deaf group. Item 63 is using possessive pronouns, such as that example of his or hers, and this was deemed specifically difficult for the deaf of hearing group. So here we have all of the 4-year-olds with the delay, and once again, we'll be focusing on our 2 cohorts' performance within the orange box. So item 71 was deemed difficult for both the deaf of hearing and deaf of deaf group, and this is using rhetorical questions So this would look something like, my name is what, and then I could say Jamie is my name. Item 77 and 78 were both deemed difficult for the deaf of deaf group specifically, and 77 is using the two of us or three of us, which would look like this, two of us or the three of us. And item 78 is classifier in action, such as showing like a man climbing up a pole. Finally, we have our 5-year-old with the delay, where we'll be focusing once more within the orange box. There were only 2 items that were flagged for this age group, those being 106 and 111. Item 106 is number distribution, such as leaves falling singularly, plurally, or randomly. And this was deemed specifically difficult for the deaf of deaf group. Item 111 was deemed difficult for both the deaf of hearing and deaf of deaf group. And this is using noun modification to indicate spatial arrangement. So this could be like trees in a row. So what we found was contrary to my hypothesis. We were only able to identify one item of difficulty for the deaf of hearing group specifically, and this was that item 63, using possessive pronouns such as his or hers. We then asked ourselves why, and we have a few potential explanations. So deaf children of deaf adults can sometimes be held to a higher standard of signing, and this can happen sometimes when assessment is taking place within a place like a deaf preschool. In addition, there can be children with language disorders mixed into our sample, and there could be a higher incidence within the deaf of deaf group. And the deaf of deaf group as a whole may not have master number representation, as many of the items that were flagged involve numerics. Additionally, there could be assessor variability as parents, educators, and physicians had access to the VCSL. And finally, our sampling size is on the smaller side, so it may not be fully representative of our group. So future work may solidify items that are indicative of a language disorder. Future researchers could look at an item such as the two of us or three of us, potentially as a red flag for the deaf of deaf group. This could be an item that we would expect deaf children being exposed to this good and native language model would have in their repertoire, if not due to a lack of exposure. And this can aid in early identification as well as intervention. Additionally, future work might integrate most difficult items for deaf children into activities as a resource for both early intervention and preschools to facilitate this visual language learning and pinpoint areas that children might need that extra support in. So the product of our project, Dr. Allen, Dr. Morier, and I decided to create a research brief to complement the work we had done. And we focused on educating a wider audience, focusing on the community, including parents, educators, and physicians. Our purpose was to discuss language pathways with stress on accessibility. We also included resources for community members to learn more or find support for deaf children. And once we finished writing the brief, we passed it along to Dr. Allen and Dr. Morier's deaf colleagues to get their feedback before publishing the brief to the Visual Language and Visual Learning Lab's website through Gallaudet. I'm happy to report that the brief was well received and should be accessible via the VL2 website later this spring or summer. My overall PIRE experience, I can't say enough great things about. I learned so much about research and data analysis and was able to develop both professional and interpersonal skills that I'm going to be bringing with me beyond Penn State. In addition to my smaller meetings with Dr. Allen, we had continuous collaboration with past fellows, as well as Dr. Miller, Dr. Allen, Dr. Morier, and other Gallaudet faculty, where we could both share ideas and gain feedback. PIRE also opened doors for me in regard to graduate school, and without this program, I would have never taken the leap to applying to Gallaudet as well as other programs. Finally, I would just like to say thank you to all of you for listening today. Thank you, Dr. Miller and Dr. Allen, for being amazingly patient mentors, as well as Dr. Morier and Dr. Chen Pickler for all of the great feedback. And thank you, Dana Winthrop and Maury Yeager, for teaching me the ropes. Of course, thank you, Heather Mann and Miriam Sinoa, for organizing us and making the transition to the online and virtual space so seamless. And finally, thank you to the National Science Foundation, because without them, I would not be a PIRE fellow. Here are my resources. And here's just a previous poster in case anybody wanted to reference any of the images I used while they asked questions. But thank you again. Feel free to ask away.
Thank you, Jamie, for sharing your research with us. So we have time for questions.
Hi, here's Jeanette van Hel. Thank you very much, Jamie, for sharing this wonderful research. This is a pretty unexpected finding, right? So I was thinking, could it be the case? So all the possible explanations that you put forward make total sense to me, but perhaps there's an additional one. So the children, so the deaf of deaf children are basically supposed to, acquire their first language in a more natural way, whereas the deaf of hearing children, their parents may have had to put in additional effort in order to learn sign language themselves, and then communicate with their children. So could it be that the deaf of hearing children may have actually benefited from the additional efforts that their parents had to put in language learning, whereas the deaf children, they were just supposed to learn language in a natural way?
Yeah, so I definitely think that that's a possibility. And actually, Dr. Allen from Gallaudet is here today, and he actually came out with a paper recently that goes more into the fact that the level of the signing is a lot more indicative than the hearing status of the parent. So if these hearing parents are putting in a ton of effort and their ASL skill is really high, then we would expect, I think, a lot better outcomes for those children. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Allen, but I remember that being a nice conversation that we had.
Thank you.
Of course.
Anyone else?
Jamie, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So very interesting work. Again, this is the counterintuitive finding, makes us think a little bit more. Do you think if you take your deaf of deaf group and you were able to further divide it into, where both parents are deaf versus one of them was deaf, whether you would see any indication, anything that you can use to assess your hypotheses that you're putting forth?
That's a really good question. I hadn't actually never thought of that, but I could see the potential for that as well. If one parent is deaf and one isn't, you would, I guess this is an assumption on my part, but you would assume that since if they were together, they'd be able to communicate within ASL. So they'd probably also be a pretty good language model, but that's not always the case. So I'm sure breaking it down that way even further would yield some interesting results.
Thank you.